Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we dive into this week's Bible reading. Join us as we seek to understand the Word more fully so we can live by it more faithfully. Thanks for listening in. I'm Todd Dreher, and I'm joined here by Kim Meyer and Rhonda Mallor, with Tiffany Tonner behind the soundboard. This week, we're looking at two very different sections of the Holy Week. On Monday and Tuesday, we'll read about the widow and her two mites, but then get ready for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday's reading.
Yeah, I understand why you say that. On Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we read three different accounts of what is sometimes called the Olivet Discourse, discussing the destruction of the temple and the end of the age.
And if I'm right, this includes apocalyptic material.
Right, like the stuff that has this really strange imagery and symbolism with it.
Really? Sorry, I was actually just worried about how I pronounced the word. I actually didn't know what it meant. Thanks, Todd. So anyways, that's what this book also includes. So besides the book of Revelation, this is some of the only apocalyptic passages in the New Testament.
Right, and we're the lucky ones who get to try to explain it, right?
Right, I wish, where's Ron when we need him?
Right.
Really, seriously? But we do need to let our listeners know that this is difficult material. We don't fully understand it, but we just want to try to give you some information that will hopefully just encourage you as you read through it, because it's tough stuff.
Everybody knows the story of the widow's mite, but I noticed something this time. In Mark and in Luke, the story about the widow's mite follows when Christ's earthly ministry has come to a close, and then right before he gives his Olivet Discourse. I wonder if that was a bridge, kind of from when that connects when he says goodbye here on earth and then till he comes again. I also wondered, and I'd love to hear your opinions on this, do you think he was indirectly just setting the stage for, okay, this is the attitude he wants to see in us as we live out our life on earth and wait for him to return?
Those are good thoughts. Throughout the Old Testament, God champions the widow and the fatherless. Like in Psalms, it says, a father of the fatherless and a defender of the widows. He even taught his people to only harvest grain, olive oil, and grapes once a season, leaving a gleaning for the fatherless and the widow and the stranger.
And then when he came down to earth to fulfill the law, he summed it up into two parts: to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, as he closes his ministry, I think he puts a period or an exclamation mark on that by commending the widow as an example, because she gave her all out of her nothing, willingly, humbly, with a gratitude toward and a trust in God.
Just like Jesus is going to do as he gives his life.
Yes.
And I love that, championing the widow. That's really cool. It's not just a story of the widow's sacrificial giving. It's an example of how we should live. Near the beginning of each passage that we read on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, the disciples asked Jesus two questions. When will destruction of the temple happen? And what are the signs of your coming and the end of the age?
Right, and it seems like, Kim, that Jesus has two answers. First, before this generation passes away. And second, no one knows the day or the hour except for the Father.
So, Todd, to me, that's a little confusing. What will occur before this generation passes away? What's he mean?
So as we look back in history, obviously the temple was destroyed about 37 years after this was discussed. But then also the Son of Man has not come in the clouds. So there's kind of two different topics going on, I think.
So he's using imagery that was used back in Isaiah, kind of like whenever Jesus was first arriving on earth. The Jews knew the Messiah was coming, and they had some details, but they didn't know exactly when that would happen. It wasn't completely obvious. But just like when Jesus comes back, it won't be completely obvious. We won't know his exact arrival.
Yeah, good point, Kim. Instead of giving the disciples exact answers, he seems to focus more on how to act, respond, and be prepared.
Yeah, that definitely seems like Jesus. He opens the door and then hits the heart.
Right.
So give me some examples of that from this passage.
Sure. So I went through Mark 13, which was one of the passages that discusses this, and just counted the command statements.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are at least 15 of them. For example, he starts out and says, watch out that no one deceives you. And then he later says, be on guard. You will be handed over to local councils and flogged. And later he says, those who stand firm to the end will be saved. And then he finishes the passage by another command and says, no one knows the day or the hour, so watch.
Wow, that's a lot of commands, Todd. And who says Jesus doesn't care for us? Not only does Jesus care and give us commands to live by, but there's also history to Jesus' words. Woven throughout his answer are all sorts of references to the Old Testament. Am I thinking right on this, Todd?
Yeah, you are. So he echoes Isaiah with the sun and the moon darkening and the skies being rolled up as a scroll and the stars dissolving. But then the book of Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation that Jesus refers to in this passage.
Boy, sometimes everything about all this end time stuff, listening to it and reading about it, gets a little scary.
You're right. But remember, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and of a sound mind. So Jesus is preparing us for the end and doesn't want to cause fear and anxiety, but rather encourages us to be vigilant and ready.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that in the same sentence where he warns us to be on guard and don't let our hearts be overburdened or weighted down with dissipation and drunkenness, he includes not to be weighted down with the worries and cares of this life.
Ugh, that's convicting. Not only does he not want us wasting our time on sinful pleasure, but it's about faithfully trusting and not being bogged down with fear and worry.
That's right. But you know what's really neat is that when Jesus tells us something, he teaches us how. In Luke 21:34-36, he begins with, take heed. If you look up the Greek word here, it's proseko, which means to hold your mind, which is your thoughts, your feelings, and your will, to pay attention and be cautious. It represents an inward commitment, an examination of our heart. He says the same thing in Mark 13:33. But in this case, the Greek word is blepo, which translates into intent, earnest contemplation. There's no way about it. He wants us focused.
Okay, so Jesus teaches us to take heed lest our hearts become overcharged or weighted down. So to watch, pray, and guard our minds so that we will not be caught unaware.
Right. And as you and Kim pointed out earlier, we know these things will come to pass. We know he's coming back, but we don't know the day. Yet, because of him, we can be peacefully prepared, aware, and ready.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, Rhonda, we are reading some heavy stuff about the future of the temple, for sure. But I think it would be helpful to step back and look at the history of the temple.
I agree, Kim. And it can get confusing because we're not talking about one temple, we're talking about three. Jesus is talking about the current temple, which was rebuilt by Herod, but that was the third one.
Yeah, you're right, because the first one was built by Solomon, but now we're talking about Herod's temple. But as I talk about the temple, it honestly rolls right off my tongue. I don't know about how you feel, Rhonda, but as I read about the temple in the Holman's Bible Dictionary and different commentaries, it's massive. Did you know that the altar alone was 30 by 30 feet and 15 feet tall?
Wow.
Yeah, it was huge. And in that same place, there was a metal basin of water that was 15 feet in diameter and 7.5 feet high. That holds 12,000 gallons of water. I mean, a large tanker today only holds 11,600. I was just blown away.
That's really amazing. It's kind of like the ark. Everything's so bigger than what we realize.
It's so bigger than what we read, right, on the page?
Yeah. And remember, Kim, when Solomon built the temple and all the stone pieces were pre-cut before they were taken to the temple because there was to be no hammer or axe heard in the temple while it was being built. It just always amazes me that it could come out so perfect when it was all pre-cut.
Right, and they didn't have computers or anything, so it's just like amazing that obviously God's spirit was there and a lot of effort and precision went in and put forth in God's dwelling.
Yeah. When Jesus foretold the destruction of the temple and how one stone wouldn't be left on another, can you imagine how the Jews felt? I mean, their temple?
Yeah.
No wonder it brought so much emotion.
Right, because the temple not only was physically huge, but it was a huge part of their religion. So maybe that's why it was a major problem. The physical temple had become too important, and its original purpose was becoming clouded.
You know, I would encourage our readers to read 1 Kings chapter 8. It's when Solomon dedicates the temple and offers a beautiful prayer up to God. And if you keep going into the first 9 verses in chapter 9, then you get to read when God responds to Solomon's prayer. When the temple, which was a place for them to come and worship and pray, became so much more to them than that, well, then God just allowed it to be destroyed.
Yeah, Rhonda, it would be an extra read, but very fitting. Listeners, if you decide to read 1 Kings 8, think of Israel's journey. I found it fascinating to look at Israel's history from the perspective of Solomon's prayer.
Yeah, bottom line here, God wanted his temple to be a house of prayer, a place for people to come and encounter his mercy and know that the Lord, he is God.
As I think of the temple and the widow with her 2 mites, Matthew 6:21 comes to my mind. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. You know, the widow's sacrificial giving shows us where her heart was. The temple was supposed to be the heart of Israel's worship, but Jesus foretells of its destruction. This had to seem so contradictory to the Jews.
Yeah, I get that, Kim. When we look at the whole Bible, we can see where God's heart is and where his treasure is, and it's with his people. Think of those important times where God pursues his people, like the garden, Noah, Abraham, Moses, the temple, and finally Jesus. And even though we mess it up, God keeps pursuing us. God's heart is with his people.
And when Jesus returns, God will claim his treasure, and we will behold the ultimate treasure of heaven, God.
Amen. We don't know the details of when this will happen, but we can watch, pray, and prepare now, just like Jesus said in his discourse. I can't think of a better way to start that than by digging into his word together. Thanks for listening in, and may God bless your week.